It was a typical evening at Pemberton's Bistro, a fine dining restaurant tucked away in Portland, Oregon. The kind of place where soft jazz played in the background, and the clink of silverware against porcelain plates punctuated the quiet conversations around the room. The restaurant was bustling, but in that refined way that only an upscale bistro can, polished, efficient, and a little distant. But then, the door opened, and everything shifted. A woman walked in, her presence immediately noticeable. She was older, with an air of quiet dignity, and there was something about her that made the whole room take a subtle pause. She was a black woman, her skin a rich shade of brown that seemed to glow under the soft lights. She wore a navy blue coat, the fabric embroidered with intricate patterns that spoke of elegance without being flashy. Mrs. Holloway, as she would later be known, moved through the door with a grace that didn't demand attention, but certainly earned it. She approached the hostess stand, and the young woman behind it greeted her with a forced smile. There was no warmth in the exchange, just the mechanical motions of greeting a customer. The hostess, as polite as she tried to be, was clearly uncomfortable. She led Mrs. Holloway to a table in the far corner of the restaurant, away from the main dining area. It was a spot near the kitchen, with a view of the bustling staff moving around, but not much else. To anyone else, it might have seemed like an ordinary table out of the way, perhaps, but nothing out of the ordinary. But Mrs. Holloway's table was a reflection of something deeper. She was being placed at the back, away from the main flow of attention, and in a place like Pemberton's, where every detail is meant to be perfect, that placement spoke volumes. As the hostess walked away, a few customers glanced at Mrs. Holloway. There was a curiosity in their eyes, a kind of quiet judgment that only the most observant would catch. It didn't help that the waiter, Todd, was completely oblivious, or, perhaps, more accurately, uninterested. He was a young man, eager to be friendly with everyone except for the woman at that table. He passed by her several times, his eyes locked straight ahead, moving quickly as if he had somewhere more important to be. The table next to Mrs. Holloway was treated with the kind of attentive service expected in such an upscale restaurant. Refills were offered, compliments were made, and the customers were treated like they were the only people in the room. But not Mrs. Holloway. She sat there, quietly scanning the menu, her demeanor calm, composed. There was no sign of frustration on her face. She didn't raise her hand for attention, didn't wave the waiter down. She was patient, waiting as if she knew it would all unfold in its own time. Minutes passed 10, maybe 20. Still, no one approached her table. Todd made his way around the room, checking on every other table, offering refills, asking about the meals, and making small talk. But Mrs. Holloway's water remained untouched, and her place at the back of the restaurant remained as isolated as it had been when she first arrived. It wasn't hard to see what was going on. Todd's behavior wasn't just negligence, it was intentional. Mrs. Holloway, no matter how quietly she sat, was being disregarded. She was invisible to him, and worse, invisible to many of the other customers as well. As the night wore on, the subtle discomfort in the room began to grow. The other diners, who had initially been too caught up in their own conversations and plates of food to notice, were now starting to see the disparity. The once quiet murmur of background chatter began to feel tense, like a cloud hanging over the room. Everyone in the restaurant could feel it, their collective gaze shifting uneasily between Mrs. Holloway and Todd, wondering how long this would go on. The silence in the room was deafening, but no one spoke up. It was as though everyone had been trained not to see the injustice happening right in front of them. And through it all, Mrs. Holloway remained composed. She didn't call for attention. She didn't storm up to the counter and demand to be served. She just sat there. She had a kind of patience about her, an understanding that whatever was happening around her would eventually reveal itself for what it truly was. But still, the question hung in the air. How much longer could she wait? It's funny how people can sometimes see the same thing, but interpret it in completely different ways. Most of the customers in Pemberton's bistro probably didn't notice anything unusual at first. After all, Todd had been serving the other tables with his usual charm, quick with a smile, efficient, making small talk with those who were paying attention to him. He seemed to have no problem giving them what they needed, no problem with the extra effort. But with Mrs. Holloway, it was as though she didn't even exist. For a while, there was nothing overt about it, just the subtle glances Todd would throw her way as he moved past her table, not stopping, not acknowledging her presence. His eyes would briefly flicker in her direction, then immediately look away, as if he were trying to avoid making eye contact. It was a deliberate act of omission, one that you might not notice unless you were looking closely, and in the bistro, there were only a few of us who were paying close enough attention. As time passed, Todd's neglect became harder to ignore. At first, he passed by without a word, but then, as the minutes dragged on, it became more noticeable. Other diners began to look up from their meals, taking in the scene. The awkwardness in the air started to become palpable. Mrs. Holloway hadn't been given a glass of water, let alone a proper greeting. She hadn't been asked if she was ready to order. She was simply there, forgotten by the young man who was supposed to be making her experience at Pemberton's bistro enjoyable. The other waiters, too, started to notice. They saw Todd moving quickly around the room, going from table to table, with ease, always with a smile, always making sure their needs were met. But not Mrs. Holloway. She was still sitting there, patient as ever, but visibly more isolated with each passing moment. There was something about the way she carried herself, her quiet dignity, that made her presence even more stark against Todd's casual disregard. She didn't fidget or tap her fingers nervously on the table, didn't sigh or glance at the staff in frustration. No, Mrs. Holloway just sat there, as calm as the still waters of a lake at dawn. But beneath that calm, you could tell her patience was being tested. At one point, Todd even stopped by the table right next to Mrs. Holloway, where a couple of regulars were seated. He leaned in, exchanged pleasantries, and made sure they had everything they needed. He lingered there for a moment too long, chuckling at something they said, before moving on to the next table, and that's when it became clear to me. This wasn't an accident. Todd wasn't just a bad waiter. No, there was something more to it. He was actively ignoring her, and for what reason? Was it because she was older, because she was black, or was it simply because she was sitting at a table in the back, where she couldn't easily be seen? The more I watched, the more I began to feel uncomfortable, and it wasn't just because I was seeing poor service. It was because I knew exactly what was going on. It wasn't until about 20 minutes had passed that Todd finally made his way over to Mrs. Holloway's table. He approached her slowly, his body language closed off, as if it was an inconvenience for him to be there at all. There was no greeting, no attempt to make her feel welcome. He simply stood there, a few feet away, arms crossed, his eyes avoiding hers. "Are you ready to order?" he asked, his voice colder than it should have been for someone in the service. "Industry." Mrs. Holloway looked up at him, still composed, but I could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it exhaustion, frustration, disappointment? It was hard to say, but she didn't speak for a moment, just taking him in. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I'll have the salmon, please." Todd nodded without another word and walked away. No further pleasantries? No. "Is there anything else I can get you?" Nothing to indicate that he valued her as a customer, and that was the moment I knew I had to step in, but I didn't move right away. I stayed in my seat, watching. I wanted to see just how far Todd would go. By the time Todd had delivered Mrs. Holloway's order a plate of salmon that was placed on her table with the slightest hint of distaste, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the restaurant. The air was thick with discomfort, a heaviness that hadn't been there when the evening first began. The diners, who had once been content with their quiet meals, were now subtly aware of the drama unfolding in the corner. It was hard not to notice Mrs. Holloway's isolation, but it was even harder to ignore the waiter's blatant disregard. Most of the people in the bistro, I'm sure, didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to be the ones to speak up, but even from my vantage point, I could see that they were all watching. Their glances kept flicking toward her, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed discomfort. It was as though they were waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Mrs. Holloway, for her part, remained composed, her face as calm as ever. She hadn't so much as raised an eyebrow at Todd's behavior. She sat there, eating her meal at a steady pace, her posture upright and dignified. There was no hint of frustration on her face, nothing that would have given away the tension building under the surface, and that, I think, was what made the situation all the more troubling. She wasn't reacting the way people might have expected her to. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't demanding attention. She wasn't even looking at Todd with any sort of visible disappointment. Instead, she kept her eyes on her food, her focus unwavering, and her composure intact. It was hard to say whether she was fully aware of how many eyes were on her, but it didn't seem to matter. Mrs. Holloway wasn't there to cause a scene. She wasn't there to make waves. She was there to eat, to enjoy the food her son had chosen for her, to have a quiet night out. And yet, as the minutes ticked on, it became clear that she was the one being put on display. Todd, however, couldn't seem to shake the discomfort he felt in the face of her quiet strength. He returned to the table several times, but his demeanor was always stiff, like he was forcing himself to do something he didn't want to. He would glance at her for a moment, speak curtly, and then scurry off to the next table. The whole scene was so uncomfortable that even some of the other waiters began to look over, sensing the tension in the air. It was around this time that Elijah, Mrs. Holloway's son and the owner of Pemberton's, noticed what was happening. He had been sitting at a table in the back, a little more removed from the hustle and bustle of the dining room, but the sight of Todd's neglectful behavior had caught his eye. At first, Elijah stayed where he was, watching silently. It wasn't in his nature to overreact, and he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He was a man of patience, one who believed in letting people show who they were before making judgments. But as the evening wore on and he saw Todd's repeated lack of attention to his mother, Elijah's discomfort began to grow. He knew something needed to be done. Still, he remained seated. He wasn't going to rush in without thinking. After all, sometimes people reveal themselves in the most telling ways. Meanwhile, Todd continued to move around the room, his behavior growing more erratic as his discomfort with the situation mounted. He seemed to be avoiding Mrs. Holloway on purpose, almost as if he feared getting too close to her. He was quick to engage with everyone else, but he couldn't bring himself to face her with the same courtesy. It wasn't lost on anyone in the room that Mrs. Holloway was a regular at Pemberton's. She had dined there many times before, and yet tonight, for some reason, she was being treated as though she was invisible. The other customers had begun to notice the disparity. Their casual conversations turned quieter, their glances lingering a little longer than they should have. Some of them exchanged uncomfortable looks, unsure of how to react. Was this just bad service, or was something else at play? Elijah watched it all unfold from the corner of the room, taking note of every interaction, every second that Todd spent ignoring his mother. He didn't need to do anything yet. He was still letting the situation reveal itself. But it was clear to him now, Todd was treating Mrs. Holloway differently from the other guests, and that wasn't something Elijah was going to let slide. As the evening dragged on, Elijah's mind was racing. He wasn't sure what he was going to do yet, but one thing was becoming crystal clear. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without making a stand. And the more he watched, the more he realized that this wasn't just about bad service, it was about something deeper. It was about respect, and that's when the weight of the moment hit him. This was no longer just about dinner at Pemberton's Bistro. It was about standing up for the dignity of those who, like his mother, are too often overlooked, ignored, and treated as less than. The tension in the room was thick, and it wasn't going to be long before something had to give. By the time Todd had passed Mrs. Holloway's table for the 5th time without so much as a glance in her direction, something finally snapped. It wasn't an explosive moment, no shouting or drama. It wasn't even a loud intervention. But it was as clear as day. Elijah had seen enough. He stood up from his table, his movements deliberate but calm, and walked slowly toward the front of the room. His steps were measured, not rushed, but purposeful. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing against his chest, and with each step, his resolve grew stronger. As he approached Todd, who was at the bar chatting with a customer, he didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He didn't need to. The tension in the room, palpable and thick, was enough to signal that this wasn't a normal situation. Elijah didn't even need to look at Mrs. Holloway. He already knew what had been happening. He could feel the injustice in the air, could see it in the way the other customers were now watching, waiting for something to break. When Elijah reached Todd, he didn't hesitate. "Todd," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I've been watching you tonight, watching how you've treated my mother." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the bistro fell silent. The hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, all seemed to stop. Everyone turned their attention to the two of them. Todd froze, his eyes wide with surprise. He didn't expect to be called out, certainly not in front of the entire restaurant. His shoulders tensed, and he took a half step back, as if trying to put some distance between himself and Elijah. He had no idea what to say, no way to defend the way he had treated Mrs. Holloway. "I'm sorry, sir," Todd stammered, his voice almost inaudible. Don't apologize," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharp. "You've ignored her all evening. You've treated her like she doesn't matter, like she's invisible. You've made her feel small in a place that's supposed to welcome everyone. And that's something I'm not going to tolerate." The room remained silent, but Elijah's words were a clear message. It wasn't about one bad night of service. It wasn't even about Todd's failure to properly do his job. It was about something deeper. It was about respect, about dignity, about the humanity that should never be overlooked, especially not in a place like Pemberton's Bistro. Todd opened his mouth to speak again, but the words didn't come. He was rattled, his usual confidence strained by the gravity of the situation. He knew he had been caught in something he couldn't easily escape. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Todd tried once more, but the stammering apologies were hollow now. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, the weight of their judgment pressing in. Elijah shook his head, not in anger, but in disappointment. "It's too late for apologies. You've shown everyone who you really are tonight, Todd. And that's not someone I want working in my restaurant." There it was, the decision was made. No more second chances. Without giving Todd another moment to respond, Elijah turned and called for Dana, the restaurant manager, who had been watching from the back. She hurried over, and Elijah gave her a firm nod. "Please, take over this table and make sure Mrs. Holloway is taken care of. Todd is done for the night." Dana didn't ask questions. She knew exactly what had just transpired. She moved toward Mrs. Holloway's table, immediately offering a warm smile and a genuine apology for the treatment she had received. Elijah, on the other hand, didn't look back. He didn't need to. His focus was clear. This was the right thing to do. As Todd stood there, stunned and silent, Elijah turned toward the door. "And Todd," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying through the quiet bistro, "don't come back." Todd's face flushed, and he took a step forward, but it was too late. The moment had passed. With nothing left to say, he turned and walked out the door, his head hanging low. The restaurant was still for a moment longer, as if holding its breath, but then, almost as if the tension had been released, the murmurs began. Conversations that had been suspended in the air started back up, but with a difference. There was a new energy in the room, a quiet recognition that something had been set right. Mrs. Holloway, now being taken care of by Dana, smiled warmly at the manager, her composure never faltering. Elijah stayed near the back, his gaze still fixed on his mother, making sure everything was going smoothly. The restaurant, once tense and uncomfortable, began to breathe again, the air lighter with each passing moment. After the confrontation with Todd, the restaurant was quieter than usual. The tension that had filled the air just moments ago now seemed to dissipate, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. It was as though the very space had been transformed. What had been a dining room full of polite indifference had turned into a place of quiet reflection. Elijah stood by the back of the room, his eyes now on his mother. Mrs. Holloway, her plate of salmon untouched for the moment, was calmly conversing with Dana. She didn't seem to mind the attention that had come her way, nor did she seem to care that the entire restaurant had just witnessed a moment of confrontation that would likely become the talk of the evening. She was, as always, composed, graceful, dignified, unshaken by the drama around her. Elijah, on the other hand, felt a knot in his stomach. He was still processing what had just happened. His heart was still racing from the confrontation with Todd, the words he'd spoken, and the decision to let his employee go. It had been hard, so much harder than he'd imagined. But he knew deep down that it had been necessary. He couldn't let disrespect slide. Not in his mother's presence. Not in his restaurant. As the evening wore on, the restaurant continued to hum with soft conversation and clinking glasses. Dana had taken over Mrs. Holloway's table, making sure the elderly woman was treated with the respect she deserved. Every now and then, Elijah would glance over at her, watching as she chatted with Dana and laughed quietly at something the manager had said. He could see the lightness in his mother's eyes, the way she didn't let what had happened earlier affect her peace of mind. It struck him, then, how much of this was about dignity, about standing up for what was right, even when the world around you would prefer you stay silent. Mrs. Holloway had never once raised her voice in anger, never once let her frustration show. She had been the embodiment of patience, of quiet strength. And now, Elijah realized, she was teaching him a lesson about how to handle situations with grace and integrity. When dinner had finished, and the last plates were being cleared away, Mrs. Holloway stood up from the table, her cane tapping softly against the floor. She turned to Elijah, who had been watching her from across the room, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she walked slowly over to him, her steps measured but sure. "Elijah," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I want you to know that you handled things the right way tonight. It wasn't easy, I'm sure, but you stood up for what's right. And that's something I've always admired about you." Elijah looked at his mother, his heart swelling with pride. He'd always admired her strength, the way she had navigated the world with such quiet dignity. But hearing her words now, hearing her acknowledge what he'd done, meant more than he could put into words. It was as though, in that moment, she was passing on a piece of herself to him, teaching him yet another important lesson in life. "You were right," she continued. "Sometimes we don't need to make a loud noise to make our point. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is show the world who we are by our actions, by how we carry ourselves. You've done that tonight, and for that, I'm proud of you." Elijah felt a lump in his throat. His mother's words, so simple yet profound, had a deeper meaning than he could articulate. He had done what needed to be done? Yes, but it wasn't about proving a point. It was about standing up for the values that mattered, for respect, for dignity, for justice, no matter how quiet or subtle the injustice might be. As Mrs. Holloway prepared to leave the restaurant, Elijah escorted her to the door, his arm resting gently around her shoulders. She smiled up at him, and for a moment, everything felt right in the world. The restaurant had been through a shift, yes, but it wasn't just the energy of the room that had changed. Elijah had changed. He had learned something important, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. And perhaps the most powerful thing about that night was the quiet reminder that no matter how small or large the act of standing up for others might be, it was always worth it. The restaurant, too, had learned a lesson. No longer would it be a place where guests were overlooked or dismissed. No longer would they tolerate behavior that degraded people, no matter who they were. As Elijah locked the door behind his mother, the thought of the night settled in his chest, warm and sure. This wasn't just about a bad night of service. This was about making sure that, every day, Pemberton's Bistro lived up to the values he held dear. It was about respect, and it was about ensuring that no one at all ever felt invisible. As Elijah stepped into the quiet night, he knew that his restaurant had become something better that evening. And that change, no matter how subtle, was the real victory.